The Polish president has confirmed that for the first time in NATO's history, it had to engage in combat on its own soil. This was in response to a Russian drone incursion. But the more we find out, the more we realize what Russia's real intentions are. And is this a test of NATO, that NATO might just be failing? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Hit that subscribe button and let's talk about it. Okay, so this is actually wild because initially, we heard reports of Russian drones pushing into NATO territory, particularly eastern Poland. But as we've talked about in previous instances, Russian drones either violated Polish airspace as part of a jamming effort. Ukraine for a time was actually using GPS spoofing to confuse the drones programming and make them unsure of where they were. And at times those drones veered towards Polish airspace. In other instances, you saw Russian drones entering Polish airspace as part of kind of a loop around heading towards cities like Lviv, trying to approach from a different angle. And because Lviv sits on the Polish border, those drones would occasionally make these incursions. Neither of those, though, were framed in the way that Poland has just framed it, where they have come out and said explicitly, Polish Prime Minister said last night, Polish airspace was violated by a huge number of Russian drones. He said those that posed a direct threat were shot down. Now, it was also referred to as a violation of Polish airspace by drone-type objects. And this is a huge change, particularly because it has led to Poland activating Article 4, which involves calling essentially a meeting of allies to discuss what has happened, compelling NATO senior countries to send officials to at least address the situation and come up with a unified response. In fact, Donald Tusk himself said, quote, "The situation brings us the closest we have been to open conflict since World War II." This is unbelievable. Or rather, it would be unbelievable under different circumstances. Now, more details have emerged that let us see just what President Putin was thinking by launching this drone strike, right? So, one, Moscow's official statement is there's no evidence the downed drones over Poland were Russian. This is, of course, something that even we can verify as false, because you can look online and see the recordings of live flight tracking radar showing these drones flying from Russia through Ukraine into Poland. So again, it would be comical if it wasn't so deadly. This is like the skit with the man who drives a hot dog shaped car into a store, then gets out in a hot dog costume and goes, "There's no evidence that I drove this hot dog car into this store," right? It's transparently obvious for everyone involved. We could literally watch as the drones flew into Poland. So this right there tells you that these were obviously Russian. There is no better explanation, right? Because if there was a better excuse for what happened, Moscow would have rolled it out. And that's actually the message they're trying to send here, is by simply saying you have no evidence at all that these came from Russia when it's obvious to everyone that it came from Russia. Russia wants you to know it, because otherwise, think of the things they would say. Like we talked about, they'd say, "Oh, our drones got confused by Ukrainian jamming. It was a Ukrainian false flag." They might say things like, these drones were, these drones were civilian drones that were never meant to conduct strikes or combat operations. There's so many excuses Russia could have turned to. And the fact that they instead are just like, well, you have no evidence that these were Russian is, again, preposterous, easily verifiably false by every other NATO country, by Ukraine, and by us, the public. And so it says that, again, Russia wants us to know that while it can't come out and admit it, because that would make it an act of war, they want you to know, yeah, dudes, it was us. But the question is really why, right? And we can infer the why, in fact, from what we know. First off, we know that this was an intentional incursion because every one of these drones was actually a Gerbera. And those of you that follow the channel or that are members on Combat Vet News know that Gerberas are a subset of Russian strike drones that are meant as decoys. You might notice these have generally the same shape as a Shahed or Garan, but in fact, they are notable because they are slightly smaller, right? Have a slightly smaller radar cross-section, or the same radar cross-section, but are slightly smaller in practice, and lighter weight, and most importantly, though, are indistinguishable by air defenses from a lethal Garan or Shahed. And in fact, on Combat Vet News, the reason we see so much footage of these Garans is because they're shot down by teams using equipment that we have fundraised for them, right? So we actually have seen a ton of footage of these Garans, and they are quite sophisticated, right? Despite not being armed, they still conduct evasive actions, probably using onboard AI software. They still navigate using the exact same SIM card-based navigation system. And so they are identical and behave and appear identical to Shaheds and Garans, the lethal drones. Because every good decoy, right, needs to look as, well, realistic as possible. So, but here's the takeaway. Let's say this was a programming error by Russia or a new type of jamming by Ukraine that simply accidentally caused this incursion. Well, you would see it because, as we said, Gerberas and Garans have the same hardware and software. It's just one has a warhead, one doesn't. If that were true, right, you would see an even mix of Gerberas and Garans penetrating Polish airspace, right? Or if it were some kind of accident. But instead, you saw only Gerberas penetrate, which says that this was part of a plan. Because just like if you were to pick up a handful of rocks and you were to see only one kind of rock, only little quartz crystal flakes, you'd say someone has sorted this, right? This was intentionally sorted somehow. Whereas if you go into just a random stream bed and pick up rocks, you'll see a whole variety of different stuff. And so that, I think, is the takeaway from this, is to say, listen, clearly this was a designated strike package because only a certain subtype of strike drone entered Polish airspace. And it's significant because, again, none of them were armed. So Putin gets to maintain a level of plausible deniability and say this wasn't a military incursion. These were just military drones that, again, we don't find out that they were unarmed until they got examined after the fact. And so given that, and the other interesting factoid is that the drones were navigating in part using Polish SIM cards, right? We know that these Garans and Gerberas oftentimes use as a kind of backup navigation system is SIM cards pinging off of cell phone towers to help them triangulate their location and walk themselves onto a target, right? Now, normally these are civilian SIM cards purchased in Ukraine, right? Obviously, because they want to be able to talk to Ukraine's cell phone network. But these actually were equipped with Polish SIM cards, which says that this was definitely an intentional strike, right? Something that these, again, someone deliberately installed Polish SIM cards onto these drones prior to them ever leaving Russian territory, which obviously implies that their final destination was Poland. So what do we know then about the Russian strike? We know it was intentional. We know it's selected for non-combat drones. So there was no actual military target taking place. This wasn't a strike. This was, and it wasn't going to be for reconnaissance purposes because, well, frankly, these drones were not, they were detected from the jump, right? And so the only remaining possible explanation is that this was a test. And given that it was just 19 drones, there were two tests, I think, happening. The first one is sort of talked about here, that given that Poland downed only 4 of 19 Russian drones, it's a sign that the air defense systems, or at least NATO's willingness to employ air defenses, is far below what Russia far below Ukraine's. Because a typical Russian strike package nowadays is over 1,000 UAV drones decoys, and real. And so the fact that the NATO border, the country on the border of NATO, right, Poland, the country closest to the Russian Federation, to the conflict, was able to shoot down literally just slightly more than 20% of these drones is a sign that Polish air defenses are either not adequate or unwilling to be employed against these drones. So that is troubling a baseline, right? And that gives the Kremlin very valuable information about the readiness of NATO, right? In terms of military and logistics, but also in command and control. Because remember, if you have a military that's big and powerful and strong, but you lack the political will or the command structure or even the intelligence and insight to deploy it meaningfully, then then you don't have strength, right? It's sort of like this being the strongest guy in the room isn't going to be the best fighter if he doesn't know how to throw a punch. And this is part of what the Kremlin was testing. They're saying, yeah, NATO looks strong. They're the big guy in the room, but can they throw a punch well? And the answer to that question appears to be maybe not. Now, it's possible that Poland said, listen, some of these drones may not be heading towards targets, towards valuable infrastructure. And this is what he's kind of said aloud, at least, that we're just going to let the other ones land to see if we can learn something from them. And again, that's not crazy because it's useful. We just talked about the fact that we were able to discern intent by the fact that the intact drones were found with Polish SIM cards. If they all were blown up by air defenses, we wouldn't be able to learn that about these drones. So it's possible that this was a deliberate decision, but it still sends a signal to Putin that, again, there's a challenge. NATO is challenged in terms of the robustness of its response. But what I think the deeper message here, the deeper challenge is Vladimir Putin wants to see, is NATO willing to stand up? What happens if we escalate? Is NATO really, is an attack on Warsaw really going to be treated like an attack on New York, as NATO has claimed for most of the last century? We're going to find out. Because again, what would the response of an American president be if these unarmed drones were to fly towards New York? And is it the same response as Poland's going to get? That is of course what NATO's official stance, and it has been for years. It is the belief and the constant messaging and the demonstration through joint exercises and collaboration and coordination and meetings and pictures and posters and all of these things, all the joint interoperability doctrine, all of it is meant to signal a single thing, that when this happens, an attack on one will be treated like an attack on all. And Vladimir Putin, he's like, I think that it's a lie. I think that NATO won't show up. And so that's the question that we're facing right now. Now, in the immediate term, right, reportedly, we saw scrambling in response to these drones were Italian fighters, Dutch fighters, Polish fighters. So in the short term, NATO was able to put up their air defenses collectively, right? German Patriots, for example, were stationed in Poland and were placed on high alert. But the question is not, as we've talked about, the question is not not just a military question of can NATO military forces operate together. It's a political one. Is NATO going to take this seriously? Is NATO really going to condemn this? Right? And when at this point we look to the largest NATO military spender, the backbone of NATO and the NATO alliance, the United States. And what does the president say? Well, let's take a look on Truth Social. Why 10 minutes ago, his decisive response against Vladimir Putin is, what's with Russia violating Poland's airspace with drones? Here we go. Oh boy. What a condemnation, guys. What a decisive. And by the way, our Secretary of War, he is going to be standing up because he is not here for defense. He is here for lethality, to put the fear in America's enemies. He is posting about a meeting with Singapore 1 hour ago. Previous to that, he posted 2 days ago talking about message to our warfighters. Well, at least the Secretary of War had a great time speaking with the Minister of Defense of Singapore. That's cool. That's pretty dope. But that's not a good sign, guys. This is not the response that the NATO alliance needed. The response that the NATO alliance, that would have helped deter Putin, would have been something like President Trump saying, this was unacceptable. This is a clear sign that Putin does not want peace, and he should understand that the NATO alliance is inviolable. And then, if he really wanted to put a stamp on it, he would say, and we're proving this by those troops that we were going to pull out of the Baltics, we're doubling them. Or saying, today, I've ordered the 82nd Brigade. They are going to Poland. They're going to be in Warsaw in 48 hours. Because that's going to send a real signal to the Russians to say, listen, try us. Try us. We are hours away from putting American boots on the ground to protect every inch of NATO territory. But the fact that none of that has happened, the fact that none of these things have gone down, the fact that Trump's out here doing a Seinfeld impersonation, instead of saying, it's bad that Putin tried to attack a NATO ally. Like, is that so hard to say? Apparently it is. And so if you're Vladimir Putin, you are licking your lips. Because remember, the rest of Europe, when asked, can the NATO countries collectively, can they provide a mere 100,000 troops to maintain, not to fight in Ukraine, but to be a peacekeeping force that will take no casualties in the event that they reach some peace accord? Collectively, the entirety of Europe said, no, we can't find 100,000 troops. For context, guys, the U.S. sustainably deployed 200,000 troops to Iraq and Afghanistan for years and years and years and years. It is not even close and for additional context, the Russian army in Ukraine right now is about 600,000 people, and the Ukrainian army deployed to the front lines is about probably between 300,000 and 400,000. So again, the thing to take away from this is that the EU will say the right things. Will they take the right actions? They can't. They don't have. Every single French soldier, the totality of the French active duty armed forces is like 80,000 people. That's less than a third of the Ukrainian army, right? And less than an eighth of the Russian army in Ukraine. Russia still has another 1 million people, by the way, in Russia that they just don't activate because it would be politically unpopular to do so. So understand that the Europeans don't have the tools to muster a response. And so what is needed right now more than ever is the U.S. to demonstrate, if you want to maintain peace, you got to show some strength. And right now, there has been no sign of the U.S. actually maintaining peace through strength. And all that the U.S. has managed to do is to embolden Putin. Right? All of the critics who said that Trump was being soft on Putin, that he was rolling out the red carpet for him, that he was too deferential to Putin, it's all coming true. It is all true. Putin did not do this, did not come close to doing this under President Biden, who was not exactly Mr. Decisive. So again, what we're seeing is Mr. Peace President is more like Mr. Weak President. And again, we are entering the find out phase of whether or not an American foreign policy that consists of doing nothing and kicking our allies in the teeth is actually going to benefit America or make the world a safer, more stable place.